Today, I'm going to go through how to install Grand Prix Legends, my favorite sim, probably of all time. Try to get a good amount of light on it there. And if you watch this channel, you're most likely aware of what it's all about. So before you fast forward, please watch at least this part for the next minute or so. I want to go through a few of the gotchas with installing Grand Prix Legends and make sure you don't go through this whole thing just to be disappointed or misled in the end. First thing that'll come up for some folks, the sim is limited to 36 FPS if you want to race offline with AI, or most online servers as well will be limited to 36 FPS. Not 60, not 120. There's a patch floating around that will enable 60 FPS, but it won't really work with AI. They'll have some erratic behaviors and things. All of my Grand Prix Legends videos are done with the 36 FPS, and through video, because I'm shooting it at 60 FPS, it may not look quite like 36, but it's one of the things I notice when I come back to Grand Prix Legends after playing some more modern sims. It takes a little while to adjust. That being said, 36 FPS, I think once you get used to it, I don't really notice when I'm racing anymore, and I still have so much fun with the sim. Luckily, most of your computers out there can probably run that just fine. Second biggest thing, this sim absolutely can run on modern computers with modern controls, but it is quite tricky to get controls set up and functioning. I'll go through in this tutorial how I do it, but 9 times out of 10 when folks come to me with issues with Grand Prix Legends, or I see folks trying to install the game, they're having problems getting their controllers to work. So you need to be a little open-minded to try troubleshooting some things. The sim is limited to 3 USB controllers, and so be prepared to have to unplug stuff, shuffle USB ports around and things. There will almost definitely be troubleshooting involved in getting your specific controllers working. The game does technically work on keyboard, although I wouldn't recommend it, but you can play on a gamepad, which I know some folks do. But really a wheel is highly recommended. It was one of the first sims that really made everybody go out and get steering wheels. Third thing with the modern controls, they'll end up working fine. The force feedback and everything's actually quite good with some of the patches that we'll install, but the degrees of rotation for steering wheels is somewhat limited in the sim. You can run anywhere. I've seen some folks run up into the 500s, but I run at 300 degrees or less rotation. And I'll go through what goes into setting that up and why you might want to choose different settings, but you're definitely not going to do a 900 degree wheel and have it function right. But all of these settings are going to have to be controlled on the device themselves or in your device software. You're going to probably have to make a unique profile for Grand Prix Legends to get it to feel right. I think those are the 3 really big gotchas with the sim that I would want to call out to anybody new getting into it. The installation process, unfortunately, is not super straightforward. It's been simplified in a few ways, and I'm going to go through the easiest way I know how, but I would classify Grand Prix Legends a little bit in the enthusiast bucket. This isn't a sim, unfortunately, where you can download one file, click install, and go and drive. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I'll try to go through the steps as clear as possible. I highly recommend anybody watching go sign up for an account at the Sim Racing Mirror Zone forums. It's where the whole GPL community hangs out, and where there's troubleshooting threads you can go and put in any questions you have, and the community there is usually very helpful. I can't promise that I'll be able to follow up with comments in this video or on my Discord or anything about how to get it to work, but I'll try to help out where I can, and I'm sure there'll be some others as well. The point of me doing this tutorial is I do want other folks to get GPL up and running and see how fun of a sim it actually is. So this tutorial is going to be broken roughly into 4 parts. I'm going to go through the installation of the game using the best method I know how to configure the graphics for it, then how to configure controls. And if all that goes smoothly at the end, I'll go through how to install what I think is the best 1967 mod at the moment, as well as going through a track install so that you can go and install whatever tracks that you want to race on. So hopefully I'm not missing anything, but I think that's it. So why don't we get started installing Grand Prix Legends in 2022. So step number 1 is getting the game, and in order to follow this tutorial or install it in the way that I know how, you need the full CD version of the game. Now, you don't have to run out and try to find a copy of it. So if you have a CD version, great, you can insert that CD now. If you don't, you need to go try to find an ISO image of it. And I'll put this link in the description. This is archive.org, and they've got a backed up version of the game as an ISO file. And the ISO, it's basically an image of the CD itself, or not a picture, but a copy of the CD itself. So if you go ahead and download that ISO file, that'll be what you need. I'm not advocating for piracy. I wish there was a way to actually buy this from iRacing or Papyrus or whoever owns it today. GOG or somebody should pick it up. I think it would sell really, really well, especially if it was bundled with something to make it easier to install. But this is the state of things as they are right now. Quick word as well on the Grand Prix Legends demo, because I see it come up from time to time. Demo's great if you want to try installing the game quickly and jumping in. Doesn't feature as many options for configuring controls and things like that, but not compatible with the way that I'm going to show you how to install the game today. So if you do install the Grand Prix Legends demo, you might run into some issues trying to convert that into the full game. I think it's much easier just to do the full install as I go through here. Second thing you need is the GPL PS installer. This is an installer that includes a ton of patches and updates, both for textures and graphics and things, but also just to help get the sim running. Been out for quite a few years and was made to help try to make this easier to install. So we want the 1.08 version that I'm going to use here. Last thing here, at least for now, before we install some stuff, you do want the 4GB patch. This is kind of a generic program, but will allow Grand Prix Legends to use up to 4GB of RAM, which if you want to race at some of the really nice tracks like the Spa 67 remake, you will need this definitely. All right, so we got 3 things downloaded. Don't worry, we'll download a bunch more later, but we can get started with installing some things. Now, first thing we have to do is mount the Grand Prix Legends ISO. If you have the disk, you can just insert it in the drive. If you have the ISO file, you have to mount that. If you've never mounted an ISO before, it's basically like digitally inserting the disk just through the image. You need a third-party program to do this. I use WinCD-EMU, but there's a bunch of other ones out there. So once you've inserted the disk or mounted the ISO, we should see it here as a CD drive. It's important that you have it inserted when we go and run the installer. And this is the disk inserted into our computer now. So now we can go back and run the GPL installer, the GPL PS installer 1.08 that we downloaded. It's going to ask you which language your GPL is in. If you downloaded the ISO file that I did, it'll be US English. This is somewhat important, I believe, to make sure translations and things stay correct. It then asks you where your Grand Prix Legends CD is, and if you've inserted it or mounted the ISO file, you should be able to select that from the list of drives that you have. You then need to pick a place to install Grand Prix Legends. You can really install this anywhere you want. I wouldn't install it in the program files folder on the C drive. For this tutorial, I've made a directory called Sims on my D drive and then a subfolder for GPL. You're gonna install at least one other application here, so maybe having a directory for all your Grand Prix Legends programs might be useful. Then we get to the components screen where we can select different patches and things. My suggestion would just be to go with the complete GPL install. But if you want to go through and see the different versions of files and things that exist, you can get a sense of just how much work has gone into something like this. One thing you may want to uncheck if you're struggling for space is the repository of all updates. It's going to basically put a folder that has all of the updates here zipped up so you could switch between them if you wanted to, and it's 803 megabytes as you can see. So if you don't want that extra space taken, you can uncheck that one and the whole install will be quite small. All right, so you can go through and install that, and basically what it's doing is installing Grand Prix Legends to that directory. All right, and at the end of the install, it's going to ask you if you want to restart your computer, and I would go ahead and trust that and click yes, restart now. All right, now that things have restarted, we'll come back in and I'm in my Sims directory here on the D drive and I've got my GPL folder. If you double click on that, we now have the core game installed. It's not quite ready to go jump in and race yet, but we've got all the files that we'll need. So next up, we want to install the 4GB patch. So if we go into that and grab the 4GB patch exe, and we'll paste this directly in the Grand Prix Legends directory. This gives us that 4GB patch exe, and we'll double click that. So with the window that pops up, we want to patch the Grand Prix Legends exe file so that from now on, every exe is 4GB ready. So if you navigate to your install directory and scroll down, you'll find the gpl.exe file. Double click that, and that'll install the 4GB patch. So now that that's installed, we're actually going to go ahead and start up the sim so we can generate a player file. So double click the GPL exe. So if it all worked out fine, you should be brought to the player info window. The resolution on your monitor may have changed and flashed. You might be seeing it in a really small box in the center of the screen, or it might be all stretched out and looking weird. Grand Prix Legends menus are always in 640 by 480, I believe, really small resolution. When you go and actually play the sim proper, it'll bump it up to the full resolution that you set it to. But we've been brought to the player info screen, and all we have to do here is set up our own player file. So we can name our driver. I'll name mine Richie Axelson. You can choose the country you're from, the helmet. This helmet, it's not going to actually control the helmet color with any of the newer car sets, but it is what did it originally in the sim. I'll pick Richie's color, which is dark blue. And then I know it would be tempting to go through and select your team and everything, but we will come back to that later. So once you're done, you click the green button in the bottom right-hand corner to move on, and you'll be brought to this joystick calibration screen. We're going to come back here and set up all the controls in a few minutes once we get some other things installed. So just for now, hit OK. then hit the escape button on your keyboard, and that will ask you to discard all changes. That's all right for us. Click OK there. You're brought back to the main screen, and then we can exit the sim by hitting this red button in the bottom left. On the credits, those will pop up. You just have to hit enter once you see those. So congratulations, you have a working copy, hopefully, of Grand Prix Legends. Now we need to install all the extra stuff that makes it work with our wheel, tune the graphic settings, and finally get out there and race. So next step is to install what's called Gem, and it actually comes as a pair with this software called Igor. This is a suite of software. You can think of it as Content Manager for Grand Prix Legends, or I guess Content Manager before Content Manager existed for Assetto Corsa. Similar idea here. This is where you're going to manage all your mods, all your tracks, all your settings and everything in a separate UI that makes it a little bit easier to keep track of all those different things that you have installed. So you can download the latest Gem package on this site here. Installing Gem itself is hopefully pretty straightforward. Double click on the exe that you've downloaded and this will open up an installer. I usually try to install this alongside the sim in the same area. So I've got it in my Sims directory, and then I created a new folder called GPL Secrets, which is what it suggests, but you can actually install this anywhere you want. Second screen, it wants you to select your Grand Prix Legends path. So you want to put in where you've installed Grand Prix Legends. You can browse for it. Mine's, again, in D Sims GPL. All right, once that's done installing, we can click finish. So now in the Sims directory, I have both my GPL folder that we've already been in and this new GPL Secrets folder. If we click into there, we've got a few applications. Like I said, this comes with everything to go and race online, which is what Igor is used for. Not going to cover all that in this tutorial, maybe a different one for another day, but Gem Plus is the thing we're most interested in. So in the Gem Plus folder is just a few files. This gem p2.exe file, it's what we're most interested in. I recommend making a shortcut of this and putting it wherever you keep your shortcuts. It's what you're going to use to launch Grand Prix Legends going forward. So I've put a shortcut of it on my desktop. We'll double click that to launch Gem for the first time. So once Gem starts up, you should be brought to something like this, and hopefully it looks something like this. If it doesn't, check out the installs drop down up top, make sure it's pointed to your exe. If it's not, you can click the installs button here and go find your GPL exe, but it should know what it is from the install you did. But then also make sure that your player's selected. I've got Richie Axelson here. You should see the car that you chose, maybe if you changed that. So there's a lot of settings in Gem. This is where we're going to do everything. I'll go through some of this in this part of the tutorial, and then towards the end when I install a custom car set or updated mod for 1967, I'll also go through some additional stuff here. But this is where you can go change your car if you want. You can change which track is selected currently. You can change here the session that you're going to race. I usually just go between race and testing or championship. Multiplayer through this mode isn't what you're going to want to do if you want to do multiplayer. You also have the car set drop down, which again we'll come back to, and then the season calendar, which is also important once you get multiple seasons going. If you select the different modes like race, it's then going to pull up a bunch of options. We'll go through those later. We're mostly interested in just getting into a testing session for now. On the right here is the rasterizer setting. There's a whole bunch of these. This is the graphic driver, the graphic code that the game is going to use. These were rewritten some years ago by Nigel Pattinson, amazing member of the community. And so the V2 versions are almost definitely what you're going to want to use. You might be most familiar with Direct 3D and think that's the one to use, but lately most folks have been having most success with OpenGL as the graphics rasterizer. That's the one I use, and it's the one, even though I have an NVIDIA card and Direct 3D tends to be a better graphics engine, OpenGL runs a lot smoother just in how Grand Prix Legends processes things. If you come over to the rasterizer settings and click on that button, these are the settings I use for it. These are the settings that I use for it. 0's up top. We've got AF filtering set to 8. You can actually go up to 16, but things might get a little shimmery. 32-bit graphics is checked. I'm not running VSync since it's a 36 FPS game, unless you run 144 Hz, which I actually just upgraded to, so maybe I should try that out, but no VSync there. Direct mirror rendering is on. Some folks have trouble with that sometimes and causing some issues. Trilinear filtering also on. Mirror size 0, using the Z buffer with grouping. Then at the bottom with custom resolution is where you can put in your specific resolution. So mine is 3440 by 1440. You can try to run triples and things with Grand Prix Legends. I've seen some folks get it to work. There's no specific triples set up, so you're not gonna be able to compensate for bezels and things like that, but it can stretch over, I think, as large a resolution as you could have. I think some folks also play Grand Prix Legends in 4K, which is remarkable for a sim of this age. But we'll click OK there, done with that. Jump over to graphics settings then by clicking on the option. You can actually access these from inside the sim as well, but I usually leave all of these things checked. I do put detail level on 99. I see some problems once in a while with putting it on 100 where some tracks, if they're not set up correctly, might have some issues. So 99 seems to alleviate that. And then for resolution for now, you can leave that on the default. We'll change that once we're in the sim later. All right, so then we've just got controls left, but we'll come back to that in a minute in the control section. For now that we have all these things set, click the red button to exit gem. It might ask you when you exit if you want to rebuild exe files, and always click yes to do that. It'll process through some things and then exit. So we just need to download a couple patches that we're going to use that aren't included with the base install. The first of which is at Lee's Motorworks. Lee is an awesome member of the Grand Prix Legends community and has a ton of great mods. He's made some amazing things possible, but on his site specifically, amongst a bunch of other patches, which are all worth checking out, is the no letterbox patch. Grand Prix Legends by default featured letterbox with black bars on the tops and bottoms, and so this actually removes that. Now that we have widescreen or ultra wide monitors, we don't really want or need those black bars anymore. So you can download this patch here from Lee's site, and that will help get rid of those. The second patch we'll want to download is called the Force Feedback V3 Test Patch. It's a version 3 of the Force Feedback code for Grand Prix Legends, and in my opinion is 100% necessary if you want to use a modern wheel just to get a good feel. It dramatically enhances the feel of the cars in Grand Prix Legends and makes them, in my opinion, almost as good as something like a GTR2 or R-Factor and those engines of games. Not quite real feel levels, but a very impressive patch overall, and I can't recommend it enough if you use any Force Feedback wheel. The patch is hosted only in the forums at Sim Racing Mirror Zone. I'll also put a link to a separate download in case you haven't made an account. But like I said at the start, recommend making an account here because you're most likely going to want to download files from this site at some point. All right, so now we have our two patches download. Patches themselves are XML files, so there's something you'll become familiar with. We'll extract the ones from the no letterbox patches, and there's a few versions of this. Lee's included a great README that explains the difference from V3 and V4. V3 is the one I go with generally because it's going to remove the black bars in the cockpit and then leave the bottom one in the replays, which is generally useful. So if you click in and grab the V3, you could also grab V4 if you want, and take this XML. I'll cut this out of this directory and get back into my downloads folder, and then we can select both our XML files. Both of these files, we want to put them in the gem directory. So if we navigate back to our GPL folder and go to the GPL secrets folder that we made, in there go to the Gem Plus directory. Inside of options is where you put patches for different things. So any of the XML patches that you end up downloading from Lee's site or elsewhere, if you do download more of them, you can place them here, then they'll be available for selection inside a gem. That's again in the Gem Plus directory in the options folder. So now if we restart gem, you'll see those two patches here in the bottom right, as well as this patch car set for car sound. You can leave that unchecked, it comes by default, but we'll want to check both the no letterbox and the force feedback patch. Last bit about graphics before we get into some of the control settings. You most likely want to set custom settings within your control panel for NVIDIA, or actually use a program called NVIDIA Inspector to do this. But for the Grand Prix Legends EXE, I run with 16 times AF filtering. And then for anti-aliasing, I override the application setting and I run 4x there. This will make the graphics in the game just look a lot better. Something to keep in mind, and a quirk with GPL, is that GPL uses different executable files for every single mod that exists. If you open up the Grand Prix Legends directory, you'll actually see two, even though we haven't installed a mod. We have the GPL exe file, that's the main one of the game, and then we have this GPL C67. You'll get a bunch of these over time. This is actually the one that Gem uses when it launches the game. So if you're setting up your NVIDIA Inspector or your control center settings, you want to point them to this executable actually, because that's the one that'll be running. And as you install more mods and things, you'll get more and more executable files that build up. All right, it's time for controllers. This is probably the most complex section, and as I said at the very beginning of this video, it's where folks typically have the most trouble getting the game running. But go through what I do to get the controller set up and how it works from my understanding. If you open up your game controllers panel in Windows, you should see all your devices listed. Grand Prix Legends and many old games only recognize a limited number of controllers. For Grand Prix Legends, it's 3. And so if your controllers, if you've got a bunch of extra stuff plugged in for game controllers, or maybe even things outside of what's listed here, but other USB devices, if they're not in the top 3, the ones that you want to use, Grand Prix Legends isn't going to see them. It's unfortunately not exactly easy to change the order of the controllers here. Windows has no straightforward way to do that because it really doesn't matter in most newer games. If you do need to change the order, you typically have to go actually uninstall the device from Device Manager and then plug things back in the order that you want them to be. And that's the only way I've found consistently to shift the order here. So for myself, I've just got 2 controllers. I've got my CSL Elite wheelbase, which also has the pedals plugged into it, and then I've got my gear shifter. The order of these is going to be important when we get to a couple other steps. The other thing I'd check is that under advanced here, you've got whatever your wheel's going to be selected as the preferred device. That tends to help it show up first or make the different buttons and things work. If you're having troubles when we get later into this with certain axes not working or certain buttons not working, it might be because that controller is not listed further up this list. I used to run with 3 controllers, so I know it's possible to do at least 3, but haven't seen anybody have success with more than that. In my wheel settings as well, I lower my degrees of rotation. I actually run most often at about 270 for GPL, which back in the 1960s, Grand Prix cars had kind of random amounts of degrees of rotation. Most were around 500 degrees plus or minus. It wasn't exact science then. Grand Prix Legends, if you want the wheel in your hands to match up with the one on the screen, 270 is about perfect. You can go up to about 300, and I'll show you what you need to change in your car setups. The more you go up the degrees of rotation, the more you'll decrease the steering ratio in the setup. So you're going to have to edit the setups to make things feel snappy and good in your hands. If you plan to use an HPattern Shifter, you're going to need another program. If you're just going to use the flappy paddles, you can skip this part, but there's 2 main programs out there, GPL Shift and Fair Shift. I'm most familiar with GPL Shift and how it works, so I'll go through the process with that. But GPL Shift is how you can configure Grand Prix Legends to recognize an HPattern Shifter. The download for it's all the way at the bottom of the site, and you can go download GPL Shift Plus version 0.7.9.0 beta. So once you get the download, extract GPL Shift, and inside are a bunch of files, and you can actually take all of these and cut and paste them directly into your Grand Prix Legends directory. So once you've got those in the GPL directory, we're going to patch the Grand Prix Legends executable file to recognize GPL Shift. So double click on GPL Shift patch.exe. It'll tell you what it's about to do. It's going to enable GPL Shift, click OK. And then it says it's successfully made a patch. If you see that it failed, maybe you didn't put it in the right directory or you don't have a GPL exe, but hopefully it worked and your executable is now patched to use GPL Shift. I would recommend deleting the GPL C67 exe or any other exes that you have for different mods. It's kind of scary deleting an exe, but Gem regenerates the exe files whenever it starts Grand Prix Legends or whenever you quit Gem. So if you delete them, you'll ensure that it's going to make a copy of the GPL exe and apply the XML patches and mod patches and all this other stuff. All you need to know is if you just have the GPL exe, it's going to use that one to make a fresh copy and then install that specific mod's code. So now you got to scroll down and find the gplshift.ini file. This is the file that you can make changes to how your shifter works and how it recognizes it for Grand Prix Legends. You can open it up just in Notepad. It's kind of a scary looking document, but I'll talk you through what I know about it. There's several sections of settings to configure how your H pattern works, and we're most interested in the shifter unit section. Depending on the model of shifter that you have and how it's plugged in, you're going to have to make a change here. I've never had success with auto, although you might as well try that if you're having issues otherwise, but I usually use this USB setting. The USB setting is how you can tell GPL Shift what controller is your shifter. And so if we look back at our game controller screen, it's important to note which one your gear shift is, and mine is the second controller. So number 2, that's important. That's what we want to remember. Back in our GPL Shift file, if we replace auto here, we'll put the number that our joystick is, or our shifter, so 2 in my case, and then .USB. So if your gear shift is the first controller, you'd put 1.USB. If it's the third controller, 3.USB. In my experience, it lines up with the order that they're in that window. So hopefully there's no other USB devices interfering with you, but that's how you get it to select which one your shifter is. So that's the only required setting, but you might want to scroll further down to shifting behavior. You can take a look. You can actually map your shifter to use different patterns. Many of the cars in the 1960s used a dogleg type shifting pattern, where first was all the way on the bottom left and the second and third were your main forward and backward gears. So you can select here which pattern you want to use. The default one is probably aligned to how most shifters are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then reverse all the way to the right. But if you've got a weird shifter, or you shift on the left, or you want to make things match up more like a specific car, you can simply change this number to be the one you want to use. All right, last thing, at least for now, further in the file, you have your clutch threshold. This is how you can set that the clutch is actually required on shifts. By default in Grand Prix Legends, you don't actually need to push the clutch in. There's debate as to whether or not the drivers actually used it or not. I think it was possible in the cars to shift without a clutch, but it wasn't good on your gearbox. So they most likely use the clutch, and if you want to be forced to do the same thing, you can set a threshold here. You can have it at 0, which is off, or 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which correspond to percent. So at 5, you have to push the clutch in 50% at least for it to engage. I usually run this on 8. You don't have to push the clutch all the way to the floor, but you do have to push it in a bit to get the shift to engage. And then you can go miss shifts like good old Richard Axelson. So once you're done in here, save this file. You can always come back to it to change these things later. You don't have to redo the patch exe whenever you make a change. It's always going to read this file now because we've already patched it. If you run this again, you'll unpatch the exe, which you don't want to do. All right, almost done, I promise. Back in GEM now. If you click on controls, there's a few settings here around force feedback. You can turn on and off whether or not you want the steering to turn a bit more at low speeds or not, which is what the steering hack is. Most likely you want to have force feedback enabled, and then you have 3 force feedback settings, which you can play with as you'd like. What I use is pretty straightforward for the CSL. I run with 0 latency, 0 dampening, and then maximum force. It's kind of inverse of how you'd think it would work. The higher you go, the lower the force on the wheel is. And this is how you tune how strong the force feedback is. So back when I ran a G27, I'm trying to remember, but I think I ran around 225. With the CSL, since the engine in it's much more powerful, I actually run at about 500, maybe down to 450 if I want it to be a little bit stronger. So if you run a direct drive wheel, you might want to try a really high number here. I don't know how high it can go, but be careful at first. Make sure you're not going to break your wrists or anything. Maybe start at 700, 800. See how things feel, and you can come back here and tune it. All right, so now that we have controls set, we'll go ahead and launch Grand Prix Legends. Again, you can do that by clicking the GPL button here. So you should be brought right into the joystick calibration. If you had saved your settings before or something, you can go to options here, and then it should pop up, or there's a button on the right to calibrate joysticks. But now, moment of hope, moment of truth. If you move your wheel back and forth, hopefully you see it register. There's a couple pages or maybe more of different axes that GPL can recognize. So as long as your wheel shows up on any of these as you move it, you're in luck. Mine happens to show up as axis 0, which is perfect. So I'll be able to calibrate that. Then I'll go and move my pedals their full extent. There's my gas as axis 2. Brake, I'm not seeing on the first page, so we'll go to the second page. Hopefully we see it. There it is, axis 5 for some reason. And then I'll move my clutch, which I believe go back to page 1. It's axis 1. So you'll want to calibrate these to the full extent as you normally would in a sim, lock to lock. Anytime you make adjustments to your degrees of rotation or anything like that, come back in here and do this. So I'm gonna click OK. We'll be brought to the actual mapping screen, and we can set our control. So we'll go set our steering left and right, map it to axis 0, throttle to press that, brake to press that. You can skip shift up and shift down if you're going to use GPL shift to do the H pattern. If you're going to use paddle shifters, this is where you map those for shift up and shift down. We've got our clutch, which I'll map. I usually map my look left and right buttons to something on my wheel. Got the famous raise arm command so that you can shake your fist at your opponents. Usually map that to a button as well. And then view pit board. If you want to be able to see your pit board as you drive by, there's a setting you can toggle to always have it on. But if you want to make it optional to toggle on, there's your button for it. All right, last thing on the right, steering linearity. On any kind of wheel, you're going to want to run full linear. So you can make that full linear so that it's a nice smooth motion. On a controller or keyboard or something, you might want to experiment with less than linear. Using the arrows at the bottom, we'll jump over to the other pages. Graphics, we've already set all of these things in GEM, but the one setting that we will want to set here is the resolution. This will be the resolution the sim runs at when you're in the car, and I'll go to my full resolution. You should see all your resolutions there. Go try out that custom resolution box in GEM if you don't see yours there, but my 3440 by 1440 appears, so I'll select that. And coming over to sound and gameplay, usually raise the sounds up to max. Volume-wise, GPL is usually very loud for some reason, so we'll put that quite low. Here's your auto pit board. I leave that unchecked generally. I turn off in-car chat most often, unless you're going to be racing online. You've got your driving aids on the right. No shame in using these if you need some help, but I usually toggle those off. Then you've got measurement and date settings and things like that. All right, once you're all set in the options, click the green flag to save everything. So we should be more or less ready to go with everything. We've got our controls set up, we've got our graphics set up, so let's go see if things work. Few options here, and something important to just bring up. You have different car types. You'll have this both on the single race as well as in testing and things. Grand Prix is your full physics. The car is going to behave like a Grand Prix car from the 1960s. You do have Advanced Trainer and Novice Trainer, which are much more like Formula 2 and Formula 3 cars. A little less power, a little easier to control. If you're having trouble controlling the cars, no shame in switching these down to practice a bit. It's exactly what they're for. It's not adding any driving aids to it. It's just giving you a different type of car to drive. You also have your damage model as well, which will pop on realistic so that we can see wheels and things go flying. Now you got the host of tracks. We'll go to Watkins Glen though and click the green button to load the track. All right, so we're at the circuit now, and we're just about ready to jump in the car finally, but do go to the car setup, especially if you're using a wheel, and take a look at a few settings. Like all Papyrus sims, the default setups are pretty conservative, so you may want to have a play with the setups. There's a lot of setups out there on the net. I think the setup overall is probably fine to get you started. Would recommend lowering the fuel though, so that the car is not super heavy on fuel, so that you can do a few laps. And then importantly, and why I brought you here, is the steering ratio. Like I said when we were talking about degrees of rotation, the higher your degrees of rotation on your steering wheel, the lower you're going to want to go with the steering ratio. So when I run the 270 degrees, I usually run about 10-to-1 steering ratio. If I go up to 300, I might run 8-to-1. I think you can go as low as 5-to-1. So that might be able to get you up to 330, 340. I don't actually know, but it's play with this. If you feel like the steering's not sensitive enough, lower the steering ratio or lower your degrees of rotation on your wheel. But these are a couple settings that are important to consider to make sure the sim feels all right. We will want to save the setup. You have to do this at every track that you go to, unfortunately, but only takes a second. We'll save the setup there, select it as our current and race setup in case we were to do a race, and then click the green flag to jump in the car. All right, so we're in the Eagle at Watkins Glen. Hopefully all your controls work. Good to test out the shifter and the brakes and make sure you can stop, move the car, but I hope it all worked for you. You're now in Grand Prix Legends and you can go out and see what it was all about. Now you might notice a few things on the screen, and depending how I've cropped the video, you might not see them on mine, but I guess you'll see the miles per hour and gear indicator at the bottom. There is some HUD that comes on as standard. I'll show you how to turn that off. There's an INI file in the root directory of Grand Prix Legends where you can make adjustments. It's called Prebluda. It's kind of a fun name, but in that you can adjust what appears. I usually have almost everything off, if not everything off, just to get that ultra immersion. You can also tweak the position of it, how large things are, the fonts it uses. There might be a few custom Prebluda INI files floating around out there so that you can try out different HUDs. The sim should have bumped up to your full resolution that you have selected. If it's still at ultra low res, go check out the options setting again in the sim for which resolution is selected. But hopefully everything looks and performs well. It's actually first try here for me on this install. I guess I've done it enough times, but everything is working and feels quite good as I blast around here in the Eagle. One thing that often confuses people: to exit the car, if you hit escape on your keyboard and then hit enter, it'll pop you out. All right, so if all you want to do is try out Grand Prix Legends, that's the end of it. You don't have to go any further in this tutorial. You've got the default tracks, the default cars with some graphic enhancements, maybe not the latest that's out there, but that'll give you enough to go try out, try your best, and see what everything was all about with Grand Prix Legends. The default cars use the default legendary Grand Prix Legends physics, so it's fun to try them out, fun to see what it was all about. But there's been a lot of improvements over the years, both with additional seasons and mods, but also refinements on the 60s cars themselves. And in addition, a few redone circuits. The base install is going to include the default Spa-Francorchamps, the default Monza, both of which have been massively improved. So I'm going to show you now how to install an updated 1967 mod and also the improved Spa track. So I'll put some links in the description to where you can find all the other mods, but let's look at installing the 1967 F1 Extra mod. This is the most updated version of the 1967 cars with physics and everything that make them drive, in my opinion, a lot more like real life. So on the GPL World site, there's a couple mods here. There's an online edition, and there's also the historical mod. The historical mod's a little more complex to get going. Definitely read the installation program there. I'm going to go through installing this online edition. What this does is install basically a replacement, in my opinion, for the default Grand Prix Legends cars. It's going to be one car set, one set of cars that's not going to differ race to race, but gives you just an enhanced version to race overall, and I think is a good starting point for GPL mods. So if you download the online edition here, get that started. Alright, so once that finishes downloading, it comes with 7-zip encryption, so you do need to have 7-zip to extract that, but we'll extract. Then if we click into the folder, mods sometimes come in different ways. This one itself comes what I would call loose as a mod. Sometimes the mods though will feature an installer that just guides you through the steps, like the 65 or 66 mod. This one itself is just a folder, so all we have to do with this one is double click in, and then we'll copy, cut and paste this full directory of files to our Grand Prix Legends folder. It might ask you to overwrite some files. You can say yes if you'd like. It's just a couple of the specific driver photos. But once you paste it in there, you've got the mod quote unquote installed. Now we need to go activate it. So if you open up Gem, how you access mods is through the car sets menu. So if you click to open that, you'll see a listing of all the different mods or car sets that exist. We have some varying versions of the 67 physics, and the one up top, the 1967X, is the new one that we just installed. So if you don't see that there, maybe you didn't paste the files in the right part, but we'll click this right arrow here to activate that car set and click OK. All right, now that we've activated it, we should see it in this dropdown. So the 1967 GPL 67 is the original physics, GPL 67X is the enhanced ones. And as you install more mods, this is how you can switch between those different mods, those different physics sets. So if we select the 67X mod, you'll see some things change. Important to make sure you have the 1967X car graphics selected. If for some reason it defaulted to the car 67, things won't look right. So make sure you have 1967X selected there. But then in the top right now, we'll see we have a whole bunch more cars to choose from. The 67X mod overall just features a ton of different vehicles, different physics. Each one of these has unique physics. So rather than just racing the one version of the Eagle, we now have the T1G and the T1F. You'll notice as well the patches were deselected. Every mod can use a unique configuration of patches. So if you come down, you want to select your no letterbox patch and your force feedback patch again to make sure those are active. Grand Prix Legends has a massive database for additional tracks that continues to grow. There's a ton of excellent circuits out there. And so the GPL track database is the place to go to see what exists and then also find where to download all of them. For this tutorial, we'll download the Spa 1967 track since I think it highlights really as great as GPL can be. If you click on search here at the track database, you'll jump to a bunch of letters, and this is where you can say what letter does the track I want begin with. And so if we click S, we'll see all the S tracks here. If any of these tracks strike your fancy, you can click on Get Track to go figure out where to download it. And if any of them have the SRMZ links, that means there's maybe a forum thread that has additional downloads and enhancements. You can really make a full-time hobby out of downloading little things for tracks. It's quite fun. But we'll scroll all the way down to Spa-Francorchamps. There's a few different versions of it, the one that came with Grand Prix Legends, but you can see there's a forum thread if you want to find graphical enhancements for it. And then there's the Spa 67 version, the redid version released back in 2014. It's a must-have, as it says here. So if we click the link, we'll be brought to the SRMZ forums that has a link to go download the track. I'll also put the link directly to the track in the description of the video. But this website itself has a lot of information about the track. I recommend giving it a read. But if we click on downloads here on the left, you have a few different versions of the track. You can download high resolution or low resolution textures if you have issues running it. But if we just grab this standard version, that'll give us what we need. Right, so the track comes in a compressed file, so we can unzip that like we've been doing. You most often see a few files, and maybe an install track.exe. Spa 67 has just an exe file. Once in a while, you'll find a track that's just loose files, and you'll be able to take that folder and put it right in the tracks folder. But for the vast majority of them, you'll just double click the exe. So we'll go through the steps to install here, and you just want to make sure you have your GPL directory selected that we've been using. You always have these options to update the 67season.ini, maybe install a replay, and then also update the GP.ini. We'll dive into this file in a minute. For now, I would say leave it checked. Then click to install. All right, once that's done, the track's almost installed. If we jump back in our GPL directory, I just want to quickly talk through the season files. If you go to seasons here, you'll see several different files here depending on what mods and things you have installed. Season files are how Grand Prix Legends knows which tracks are relevant for which class of cars or for which championship. Any of the files that start with G, either the GP or the G67, those are the ones used for the actual championship mode. So if you want to change the tracks or the laps or anything about the championship, you would edit these tracks. If you just want to change which tracks are available in the single race mode or in testing mode, that'll be any of the other files. So this 67.ini file is the standard one that comes with Grand Prix Legends for the 67 season. Once you install some other mods, you may get a 66 one or a 69 one. If we open this file up in a text editor, you can use whichever one you want. It's a pretty basic file, just some simple text editing here to make changes. If we scroll down, you can see right now 12 events are in this calendar, and each one is numbered. We can see which track directory is being used for each track, the month and day it's on, the number of laps, etc. So it's all easy stuff to change. The name that's used here next to track directory lines up with how the track is called in the tracks folder. If we jump back to our directory and go to the tracks folder, this is where all your tracks will live. And so exactly how it's written here will be how you'll want it in the file itself. So if we see, we've got both a SPA and a SPA 67 folder. So this is the new one we installed. It has a different name than the original SPA. So if we scroll back through our calendar file, we'll actually see the way the track installed, it inserted it in addition to the existing one. So if we scroll down, you've got event 9, which is the default SPA Belgian Grand Prix. Then if we look further down, we've got, after event 11, we've got 12. We can just insert another space here, but we've got our SPA 67 Belgian Grand Prix. You don't actually have to make edits to this file at all to make things work if you kept that box checked while you installed the track. But if you did want to change your calendar around or swap the original SPA for the one we just installed, you can do that here. So jumping back into GEM, the season file that you have selected is available here. So if we made additional season files or you made edits and you wanted to switch between them, you could pick that here. But since we left SPA in, it should be at the bottom of the list. There it is, SPA 67. So SPA Francorchamps is the original one, SPA 67 is the new one. And there we go. So if we select that, we'll be on the new version of the track. So you can spend a lot of time going through and installing different tracks, but they all pretty much work like that. You're going to have an exe file to install, and then you'll just want to check the relevant season INI file to make sure it's in there, or if you want to swap it with another event and make the calendar clean and tidy for a full championship of racing, that you do that. But blasting around the updated SPA, it's such a nice track, and one that I think a lot of you will definitely jump right into if you get Grand Prix Legends going. If you're looking for what I'd recommend to round out the 1967 calendar, I'd also recommend the Monza 67 that came out just a couple years ago. It redoes the entire track like SPA does for the original, and I have a pretty old video on it, but it's an excellent, beautiful track as well. And outside of that, there's also a track called Monacaine, which is a replacement for Monaco. It's the same stock Monaco that comes with Grand Prix Legends that you'll already have installed, but has a more accurate chicane that makes you slow down for it. A bit more challenging too. So this one's a nice one to install too if you really like to be historically accurate. You know, I think some of the modern sims do give a better impression of driving these old cars, but Grand Prix Legends is unmatched in historical detail. If you want to race the full championship offline with all the AI, Grand Prix Legends just cannot be beat. Online racing is a lot of fun too, or doing the different competitions and things. I think you're going to have a great time racing in Grand Prix Legends. So I know there'll be a lot of questions. Like I said at the start, go run over to Sim Racing Mirror Zone, sign up for an account there. It's probably the best place to post if you have some questions. You can also try commenting on the video. I won't be able to get to everything probably that folks ask for, but maybe a part 2 at some point, or if anybody's interested, I could always make a video about some of my beginner tips for Grand Prix Legends. I think there's a fair number of things that would be useful for folks to find out. So I hope you got Grand Prix Legends running. I hope it's working well for you, and I hope you're about to have a whole lot of fun. So thanks for watching. This is GP Laps, and I'll see you all again next time.